I am so worthless. You ever feel that way? You ever feel like, man, I'm just a failure. I'm just not getting it done. And I look around and when I begin to compare myself, that's when I'm most vulnerable. I begin to compare myself with others. I think they're doing so much better than me. Why aren't I doing better? Why are things so uncomfortable, so chaotic? I compare the way things are with the way I think they ought to be, with the way I hoped they would be. It's particularly bad when I compare myself to somebody like Jim. I never called him Jim. I mean, I would never call him Jim. He was always either Dr. Boyce or Dr. James Montgomery Boyce. He went to Harvard and graduated from Harvard, and then he got his theological degree from the University of Princeton. He then got a doctorate from the University of Basel in Switzerland, and he could have become an erudite scholar or an academician, but he chose to become a local church pastor like me. And he took a position, accepted a call at the 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1968. And over the course of his ministry tenure there at 10th Presbyterian Church, he became a prominent figure in Presbyterian circles throughout America. He authored, published, or contributed to 60 books. He hosted 2 one-hour weekly radio programs, and under his tenure, 10th Avenue Presbyterian Church grew to 4 times the size it was when he had first arrived. He also encouraged the church to expand their ministry in caring for people in Center City, Philadelphia, and they had impacts in their ministries to the poor and to homeless and to women who were in crisis. They were particularly adept at providing medical services to indigent people throughout the Philadelphia area, because at 10th Presbyterian Church, under Dr. Boyce's leadership, they had a disproportionate number of medical professionals in their church. In fact, for a season, they actually had a Bible study every Sunday morning that was for physicians only, that had over 200 people in it. And for a while, that class was taught by the chairman of the Department of Surgery at the University of Pennsylvania Children's Medical Center. His name was Dr. C. Everett Koop. He went on to become the Surgeon General of the United States. When I was going to school in Philadelphia in the mid-'70s, my friends and I, as often as we could, would go to 10th Presbyterian Church on Sunday nights to hear Dr. Boyce teach. He would teach for over an hour directly from the Greek New Testament and from the Hebrew Bible. And we were always in awe of his scholarship and his eloquence. And I remember admiring him and wanting to be like him. But as I compare myself to Dr. James Montgomery Boyce, I realize how worthless I am, what a failure I am. The things that he was able to accomplish, the scholarship and the eloquence of his leadership. In that comparison, I find myself completely wanting. That's the thing about comparison. It's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, comparison is a good thing because we see how we could be. We set the bar. We establish a vision. We have an admiration and a pursuit, a challenge, a goal, as it were. On the one edge, it's a good thing that inspires us and challenges us. But on the other edge, it cuts deeply into our core of our being. Because we never quite get there. We never quite measure up. We are always seeing the world as it ought to be, seeing ourselves as we wish we were. And we wind up with a sense of self-loathing and disappointment and a sense of exhaustion in trying to meet our own expectations. And we do it without even noticing. I mean, that's the thing. The comparison is so insidious. We don't even realize we're doing it, but when we see people on the street or we cross paths with people, we're automatically comparing them to other people we know or to our expectations or to ourselves. And in those associations, in those comparisons, we begin to migrate to people that we are attracted to, people we are impressed by, and we begin to associate and tribalize with people who make us feel good about ourselves, people who we compare ourselves to, and we say, that's somebody who can make me better, or that's someone who's interesting to me. But we don't associate with the people who we marginalize and who we are unimpressed with, or we think are less than us. And the insidious, corrosive nature of comparison is it begins to drive wedges in between us and other people. And ultimately, it discourages us because the person we hope to become or the person we think we ought to be is always beyond our grasp. And I wonder how many songs have never been written and how many games have never been played, how many risks have never been taken, how many projects have never been started because we compare ourselves and we say, well, I'm worthless. I couldn't accomplish that. See, God knows that comparison is a volatile thing, a dangerous thing. In fact, God warned us about it in the Ten Commandments. In the Ten Commandments, he told his people, he said, don't get caught up in a culture of comparison. It's in the Ten Commandments. Right there along with blasphemy and adultery and stealing and lying and murder is don't compare. It's called coveting. It's when I look at someone else and I say, I wish I were them. I wish I had their stuff. I wish I had their talents. I wish I had their abilities. And God knows the corrosive nature of that. It's interesting that even Jesus warns us about it in a very indirect way. Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? Perhaps you remember that question coming to him, and he answers it in the vertical and the horizontal. In the vertical, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind. And in the horizontal, he quotes the middle of the law, Leviticus chapter 19. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, I'm not qualified as a sociologist. I'm not qualified as a social psychologist to connect all the dots, but I am qualified as a theologian. And I think what Jesus is getting at is in that culture of comparison, something is revealed about us. He says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And there's an equation that he establishes. It's A, loving your neighbor, is equal to B, loving yourself. And if A equals B, then B equals A. If I love myself, I will then be inclined to love my neighbor. So if A equals B and B equals A, then loving my neighbor is an expression of literally loving myself. But it's also true. If negative A equals negative B, then negative B equals negative A. And if I find myself hating my neighbor, I am revealing that I actually hate myself. And my self-hatred and my self-loathing and that product of falling short as I compare myself with who I wish I were or who I want to be or who I ought to be, that comparison winds up creating a hatred in my unintended expression toward my neighbor. I see it. I see it on the streets and in the cities of our nation today. What I see is people rising up and saying, we have to do better. This is the world that we hope for. This is the world that we are comparing ourselves to, and it's not good enough. And we have to get better. But what I see is a culture of comparison rising up. And out of that culture of comparison is coming a revelation of dissatisfaction, not just with the systems and the institution and the culture, but with ourselves. And I see that frustration, and I see that anger, and I see that hatred played out. Because you cannot hate others unless you genuinely hate yourself. And you see, it's human nature to seek equilibrium. It's human nature for us to want, if there's chaos in my life, I want chaos around me, because that equalizes things, that creates a conformity and a uniformity in my life. And what I see is people saying, we have to conform to certain standards, we have to do better, and we're championing this idea that conformity is the goal, and conformity works on us from the outside in and from the top down. But conformity does not breed transformation. Conformity breeds hypocrisy. Transformation, you see, doesn't start from the outside in. It starts from the inside out. It starts from the bottom up. You see, I believe that there is a better way than seeking conformity. It is seeking genuine transformation, to be transformed. And that always happens individually from the inside out and from the bottom up. It's what I like to call the way of grace. And 3 weeks ago, we began a conversation about how do we navigate in the chaos of this world, in these unprecedented times when we're experiencing things that many of us never anticipated. How do we find our way in the chaos? And I suggested that there are 4 simple steps that we can follow, and you might consider these to be the way of grace. And the way of grace begins at the bottom. All grace has to begin at the place where we are brutally honest about our inadequacies, where we recognize that we are not the people that we wanted to be, where we recognize that we are flawed and that we are broken and that we are starting from the bottom, from the base. And it's there that we stand. We say, I will stand here and be horrifically honest about who I am, about my inadequacies and my shortcomings, and I will come to terms with that. I will stare in the face the brutal reality that we are all living our lives on death row, and that none of us get out of this life alive, and we were never intended to navigate this on our own. We are all inadequate. We are all insufficient. And the way of grace begins when we embrace the grace that we cannot do it on our own. We embrace our inadequacy and we say, I want to get better, but I need your help to do it. The next step is, okay, so what do we do? If I recognize that I am not the person that I want to be, that there is so much left for me to do, what do I do? Well, you do the next right thing. You just put one foot in front of the other and you step up and you step out and you move forward. And by doing the next right thing, even in the micro decisions, in the smallest ways of choosing to be thoughtful and choosing to be kind and choosing to be observant and choosing to be careful and choosing to be generous, as we make those increasing decisions, doing the right next thing, when we come to those life-transforming decisions, we're in the habit of making the right decision. But today we come to the hardest part. The hardest part is when we realize that the road is long and the journey is difficult and the odds are against us. And we have to determine with some resolve that we will not quit. When we look around and we say, what difference does it make that I'm making the right choices? What difference does it make that I'm seeking peace and grace? What difference do I make? If I am just so worthless and my life is so meaningless, what difference do I make? And the temptation is, in that moment, to abandon our effort and to just conform to whatever we are told is what we are supposed to do, rather than being transformed by grace. You see, that's my prayer today, my prayer for everyone today, is that we would embrace that grace, that we would put on that grace, that we would recognize that the odds are against us, that life is hard, and that the challenge is always before us, that we will never arrive, but we will not quit. Because as people of grace and in the way of grace, we are not operating in our own strength. And it is not for ourselves that we do this. You know, I lived through the 60s, so I've seen this kind of thing before. But these days really are unprecedented, and it's difficult for us to get our mind around these times. But this isn't the first time we've been in seasons like this, and it won't be the last time. In fact, if you want to be reminded of that, just read through your Bible. It is a catalog of stories of people surviving in mutinous times with broken hearts and broken lives and broken people navigating through the chaos of life. And it's a story of the challenges and the failures and the shortcomings and the flaws of human existence. And I've seen this before. The Bible is full of it. 3 weeks ago, we turned the pages of the Bible back 3,300 years to a period of time that is very similar to the time that we are in. The Bible calls it the time of the judges. And it characterizes that season with the phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It feels like we are just history repeating itself. And in that story, during the time of the judges, there's a random story about an anonymous woman named Ruth. And we've been considering her story because if you compare Ruth to the great heroes of the Bible, she shouldn't even be noticed. She doesn't make the radar. She doesn't qualify to stand in the pantheon with all of the great heroes of biblical literature. Ruth was a random woman. And she was not qualified in any means to be heroic spiritually. First of all, because she was a woman. Now, I know that we imagine that we have made so much progress in our social evolution in 3,300 years, but in most of the rest of the world, we haven't barely moved the needle. When it comes to the role of women in culture in Ruth's day, a woman who was an adult woman who was unmarried and childless was basically not as valuable as livestock. And Ruth was that childless, unmarried, adult woman, but she was something else. She was the wrong race. She was a Moabite living among the Israelites. Ruth had every disqualification for significance. And in a culture that marginalized women, Ruth was worthless. Her survival and the survival of her mother-in-law were in great peril. But as we come to the 3rd chapter of the book of Ruth, Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, has a plan. And her plan is for Ruth to get her sexy on. Now, I don't know if Sigmund Freud ever evaluated Ruth chapter 3, because he would have a field day with it. He would have a field day with his 5 stages of psychosexual development and projecting them onto the characters of Ruth. Theologians have a field day with the 3rd chapter of the book of Ruth, because Naomi asks Ruth to basically seduce a member of their tribe, a member of their clan, an extended member of their family. Now we have to tap the brakes here for a minute, because there are many of you who are at home and you're sitting on your couch in your PJs with your kids. Maybe you're eating some breakfast, and that's great. You're drinking your coffee, you're relaxed. This is so cool that we can do this. I miss you being here. But I'm glad that we can actually be with you in an environment that is on your own terms. But I have to warn you that the 3rd chapter of Ruth is for mature audiences only. It's R-rated. So you may want to do something at home that you can't do if you're here, and that's mute me. Say, oh no, I don't know what's wrong with the sound, kids. We're not able to hear Pastor Dave right now. Or maybe we'll watch this later, because Ruth chapter 3 is filled with sexual innuendo. And it's because Naomi says to her daughter, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to Victoria's Secret or wherever you get the sexiest outfits that you can find, and I want you to get dressed up. And we will spend probably more money than we should on some perfume for you, so that you will make yourself seductive to a member of our family, a man named Boaz. And what I want you to do is tonight, as the men of Bethlehem are gathered together at the threshing floor, I want you to go and seduce him. You see, once a year at the end of the harvest season in agrarian communities, all of the farmers would gather at what was called the threshing floor. And the threshing floor in a village like Bethlehem may have been about the size of a basketball court, maybe half of a basketball court, and it would have been of compacted ground or stone. And ideally, it would have been on top of a hill where there were prevailing breezes, and all of the sheaves, all of the bundled stalks of the cut grain, the wheat or the oats or the barley that had been harvested from the fields would be stacked up around the threshing floor. And once all of the harvest had been completed, all the men of the village would come to the threshing floor and they would have a wrap party. And that party would go for an entire day. Starting early in the morning, they would begin threshing the grain. And what that was they were pulling out the stalks from the sheaves and beating them on the ground and loosening the seeds and the shells from the stalks. And they would take the stalks and cast them aside, and they would become feed for the livestock. And then after they had these piles of unfinished grain, they would then begin the winnowing process. And if the wind was prevailing, they would simply toss the grain into the air with their hands or with a winnowing fork. And as they threw it in the air, the husks around the grains would blow away in the wind. And what they would be left with is a threshing floor with piles of grain. And on that day, they realized that they were going to live. They were going to live another year. I mean, when you live in an agrarian society and you put a seed in the ground in the spring, it doesn't mean that you're going to see a harvest in the fall. Because there are droughts and there are floods and there are marauders and there are locusts and there are all manner of things that can steal from you your crops. But on that threshing floor, on that day, it was a celebration. It was a celebration because it meant they were going to live. They had food for another year, and the piles of grain were a testimony to the security of their future. And so the men of Bethlehem would have partied their brains out. And Naomi said, I want you to go there, and I want you to wait. And you make sure that no one sees you. Because you see, the women weren't invited to the threshing floor party. They weren't invited to the wrap party. This was a boys-only club. And they drank wine all day, and they drank grain alcohol, so that at the end of the day, I'm sure they were totally ridiculous. And the only women who showed up on the threshing floor were women who were there for, let's just say, entertainment. They were women who were looking to perhaps seduce a man into impregnating them so that they might have a child with this man. Because it was the sexual social security system of the ancient world where if you had a side wife who had a child with you, you provided for them. Some of them, I'm sure, would show up in the hopes that they might seduce a man and convince him to marry her, even if she was not pregnant by him. There were other women who just showed up because they were employed in the oldest profession in human history. And they were just there to basically take advantage of these drunken men and hopefully walk away with an apron full of grain. And so Naomi told Ruth, don't let them see you, because if they see you, you will be branded permanently with a scarlet letter. So you have to hide up above or below the threshing floor, in the weeds or in the trees, so that no one sees you. And this was a high-risk proposition because she was aromatic. She was full of perfume, and she wasn't exactly dressed in hiking clothes. And Ruth told her, and Naomi told her, you have to keep your eye on one man, just on Boaz. Do you realize how risky that was? Because there may have been 30, 40, 100 men on the threshing floor. And all of them were dressed in the same kind of agricultural garments. And many of them had wraps on their heads and over their faces because of all the dust and all the chaff that was blowing in the air. And she had to pick Boaz out of the crowd and keep her eye on him throughout the entire day, even late into the night when they were behaving like drunken boys. And it was dark, and she couldn't lay down at the feet of the wrong man. Because what she was going to do was she was going to proposition Boaz, and she was going to wait until everyone was asleep, and then she was going to sneak in and uncover him and lay at his feet and offer herself to him. And if she laid at the feet of the wrong guy, there was no, oh, no, you weren't the guy I was looking for. I was looking for that other guy over there. No, there was no takebacks on this. There was no givebacks. When she went out there, she had to know she was finding that man. This was a risky proposition, but the greatest risk of all was the risk that we all face in any intimate encounter. It's the risk of rejection. In our most vulnerable moments, in our nakedness, is when the risk of being rejected is most significant. You see, her destiny, her fate was in Boaz's hands. He could have very easily awoken and said, oh, Ruth, no, there's nothing here. There's no, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Oh, I really like you as a friend, but there's really nothing that I can do for you, Ruth. When she put herself out there and made herself available and vulnerable, her greatest risk was what all of us risk in intimacy and vulnerability, and it is that someone will disregard us or reject us. Now you can read Ruth chapter 3, you can see how the story turns out, you can see what happens, and you can see for yourself if Freud would have had a field day with Ruth chapter 3. You see, we can't really predict how this was going to go because we know nothing about Boaz and we know nothing about Ruth. We don't know how old they were. We don't know their ages. We don't know whether they were attractive or whether they were off-putting. We don't know whether they had outgoing personalities or whether they were the kind of person who was sort of unwelcome at parties. We don't know whether they were awkward. We don't know anything about them. I like to imagine, of course, that they were stunningly attractive and compellingly charismatic people. I like to imagine that actually Boaz and Ruth were like Bo Jackson and Salma Hayek. How about that? Yeah, of course they got together. That's a natural thing, but we don't know. We just don't know. We don't know the details, and we don't know the details because they don't matter. Those are the things that don't matter. What matters is what happens at the end. At the end of Ruth chapter 3, after Boaz and Ruth's encounter, Boaz commits to Ruth. He says, whatever you want, I will do. Whatever you ask, I will do. Whatever it costs, I will do. But there is a price. You see, I am not technically in line to redeem you. In the hierarchy of the tribal culture of Israel, there were kinsmen or guardsmen redeemers. And these were men of honor in a family clan for generations who were either the most influential or the most successful or the wealthiest or the most popular. And they were sort of the patriarch of the clan, and it would be their honor to look after the members at the fringes of their family. And when they were in difficult times, they would go, it was like the Godfather, and he would take care of you, And Boaz said, I'm not the Godfather, but here's what I will do. I will go and I will do everything I need to do. I will risk everything and ask if he would allow me to redeem you. And what Boaz was saying is, I will make public my affection for you. I will put on display that I think you are valuable and you are worth my redemption. And whatever it costs to my reputation, whatever it costs to my resources, I will pay it because you are worth it. For centuries, the rabbis interpreted the story of Ruth, particularly Ruth chapter 3, as an example to all of Israel of what the love of God and the kindness of God's people was supposed to look like. To embrace the foreigner and the poor and the widow, this loving heart. Boaz was held up as an icon of tolerance and acceptance and unconditional love. And for 13 generations, the story of Ruth and Boaz was an example of the nature of the love we are to have for one another and the love that the Israelites were to have for the people in their land. But we know that there was more to that story than that. Because 13 centuries after the story of Ruth and Boaz, we saw the story of the Savior of the world, of Jesus of Nazareth. You see, the story of the 3rd chapter of Ruth is the gospel story. It is what we know 3,300 years later was a foreshadowing of the Savior's love for us, of his redemption of us in our imperfection, in our brokenness, in our worthlessness. He says, whatever it costs, I will pay it. Whatever it requires of me, I will do it. Because the gospel at its core is very simple. He paid a debt he did not owe because we owed a debt we could not pay. And this is the story of the gospel. And this is the story of grace. And this is why we don't quit. Because we are worth it. Not because of the things that we accomplish, but because he was willing to say, I will pay for you. You are worth it to me. You are not worthless. You are priceless. This is a difficult thing. This is not an easy path. It is against all odds. That we would not give up in a culture of comparison, in a culture of chaos, in a culture that constantly is encouraging conformity. It's against the tide to say, I'm more concerned about being transformed than I am about being conformed. I'm more concerned about being changed from the inside out than being changed from the outside in. And in that path of just doing the right thing, the next right thing, and relying on the grace of God, there is a weariness. And a place that we come to and we say, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it? Especially when we're living in a culture of comparison. But I can tell you that in a culture of comparison, you can compare yourself all day long, but at the end of the day, one thing never changes. And that is that we are always still imperfect. The one constant in life is that none of us are perfect. Can we all get better? Can we all improve? Absolutely. Is there an edge to the sword that says, do we want to be better versions of ourselves? Absolutely. But we have to put on that grace that says, I will accept your love for me and your help for me in my inadequacy. Dr. James Montgomery Boyce spent his entire professional career at 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He became the senior pastor at 10th Pres when he was just 30 years old. He stayed there 32 years until the year 2000, when he died after a brief battle with liver cancer. He lived his entire life, 32 years of ministry in one place. And if I compare myself to him, I come up woefully short. He accomplished 10 times what I would ever accomplish. I could never compare myself to Dr. James Montgomery Boyce, except in one way. See, when Dr. Boyce became the pastor of 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, he was following in the footsteps of an icon. He did the first part of his early ministry in the shadow of one of the greatest Presbyterian preachers of the 20th century. He had been the pastor before Jim Boyce at 10th Pres. His name was Donald Gray Barnhouse. And Dr. Barnhouse was an icon in Philadelphia and a legend in the Presbyterian Church. And I may not compare well with the accomplishments of Jim Boyce, but I certainly compare myself to the same path because I know what it is to do ministry in an environment, to live my life in an environment where I am overshadowed and reminded every day of my inadequacy, that I don't measure up. But I've come to terms with that. And I'm embracing the grace that says, this is still worth it. It is still worth it to trust that he says to me, you are not worthless. You are priceless. You are worth everything to me.